begin, as I said, by talking about markets and market failure. So to review, markets are the whole set of institutions, rules, informal norms that promote exchange. Why do we use markets as a benchmark for performance? Markets generally provide an efficient, if imperfect, way to match resources to desires. We have many different, varied desires. We have many different, complicated resources that can be combined in different ways. Markets are a decentralized solution to that problem. The things that markets do well is efficiency. And I've talked a little bit about efficiency, but I haven't defined it, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about that today. There are some difficulties with markets, which may have to do with the creation of inequality, disparities in income, disparities in power. But what markets do well is produce stuff and move resources towards higher valued uses. However, the problem is there are circumstances when markets aren't even efficient. Those are called market failures. It's not fair to blame markets for doing something that markets just do. You can't blame a dog for eating out of the garbage. So saying that markets create inequality makes sense. Markets, by their nature, are likely to produce disparities in income. It's not a failure of markets, it's an aspect or feature of markets. However, there are circumstances where markets fail even on their own terms. Those are called market failures. There's two core principles on which markets operate, and we've talked about these quite a bit. The first is scarcity. Resources are limited, but human wants are infinite. The definition of scarcity is if the opportunity cost of the resource is greater than zero. The definition of scarcity, which I've not really given so succinctly before, is that a resource is scarce if its opportunity cost is greater than zero. The advantage of this is that it means things like the atmosphere, the oceans, are all scarce. Even if we don't price them, even if we don't have a system that charges you for their use, they're still scarce. If I use the atmosphere as a dumping ground for pollutants or for carbon, or if I use the ocean and take out enormous quantities of fish, thereby crashing the resource, I'm not paying for my full use of the resource, but the opportunity cost of the resource, both to other people and to the future, exceeds zero. So that's the economist's definition of scarcity. And being all now trained economists and therefore dangerous, you should know that. The opportunity cost is, and we've talked about this a fair amount, doing one thing means you cannot do another. Each activity or each resource use is costly, regardless of what you pay for it. Those costs can potentially be quantified. They're difficult, and that's the knowledge problem that we often talk about that markets help us solve. So, properly functioning markets help match price to opportunity cost. Properly functioning markets help match price to opportunity cost. If I own something, I won't sell it unless what you're willing to pay is at least as great as my own opportunity cost of using it myself. Preconditions for markets to be useful are either diverse preferences, diverse endowments, the economies of scale, which mean declining average cost as more output is produced, and specialization, the returns to tool use, dexterity, and division of labor. Now, the first two things are going to be met in most reasonably sized societies. The second two are the product of human ingenuity. We find ways to produce things and to produce things more cheaply. So what this means is, in almost any reasonably sized society, you would expect markets to evolve, and in fact they do. Independently, at different times in different places, all over the world, throughout history, something like markets has evolved, independently. Markets convey information about resource value through prices. Prices tell us about the relative scarcity of a resource and the wealth of an individual or firm. That is, how much value have I created? The amount of my profits is a measure of the amount of value that I have created. And markets provide incentives for people to act to increase the welfare of others. Markets provide incentives, when they work properly, for individuals, even self-interested individuals, to act to improve the welfare of others. So a law-abiding, utility-maximizing individual will choose a socially valuable activity. The reason I know it's socially valuable is that I can make a wage or a profit by producing it. That's the signal that I'm producing something that's socially valuable. And markets then direct resources towards higher valued uses. So that's a summary of the argument that we've made so far for markets. So we talked 2 lectures ago about externalities as a problem with this. How can we make sure that private costs and social opportunity costs are the same? Well, there may be problems, local problems with transactions costs, but let me give you an example of an externality many of y'all are probably familiar with. This was an exchange on, I think it was Reddit, which is really the source of all academic knowledge. So some schmo says, I would gladly pay so that the person in front of me cannot recline, talking about airline seats. If you're on an airline, I would gladly pay so that the person in front of me cannot recline. Where is that fee? So many fees, paying for all kinds of stuff, paying for baggage. I want to pay so the person in front of me cannot recline. What could possibly go wrong with that idea? I've actually seen people say, there ought to be a limit to how far the person in front of me can recline. You think there's not? They can't exactly go flat. They can recline about 3 inches. Still, I think of that as being my space. Should the person in front of me have the right to recline? Well, should I have the right to bid to pay either them or the airline? It's not clear who I should be paying. Because I can always pay them, knock on the seat, listen, would you agree not to recline? It really bugs me. Well, I want to recline. I understand that, but I'll pay you $5,000 not to recline. Okay, said no one ever. No one, I think, has ever offered the person in front of them $5,000 not to recline, although it would work. What this person wants is the right to pay the airline a fee of probably $5 to keep the person in front of them from reclining. The next person says, have you tried jamming a wedge between the seats? They sell those online somewhere, especially for tall people who are sick of having their knees bruised. You have to be really tall for your knees to be bruised by the seat in front of you reclining. I mean, at most, it means you can't open your laptop. The next person says, the guy in front of you paid more for the privilege. Sorry. Clearly an economist. First of all, lacking any sort of social skills. But more important, recognizing that this is already priced into the service. Airline seats recline a couple of inches, and the airline has made a decision about how to price that. I buy a seat, it comes with it the right to recline. Have any of y'all seen those wedge things that you can put on seats? The airlines have made them illegal. So they'll confiscate them if they find them. But they've got these little plastic things you can put on the seat in front of you so it can't recline. I've actually seen people use that and then themselves recline. Because what they want is more space. Well, when you put it that way, it's differently. It's not you're reclining into my space. It's I want to keep that space and the space behind me. Well, in a way, those are a kind of externality. We're negotiating over how we're going to divide this. If I take it, you don't get it. And then, I can't tell if the last one is serious or not. Now, that's an idea, letting people bid against each other for space. In principle, you could even move the seats back and forth. That would be great. So you could have little screws where you could move the seat forward 2 or 3 inches. But of course, the airlines do that themselves. They're called economy comfort seats. So even in coach, they now have an extra 2 or 3 inches for an extra $40. So what we're trying to do is recognize the opportunity cost of space and then use the price system to give people both the incentive and the capacity to respond to that. Well, what are the alternatives to markets? Markets are a way of allocating scarce goods. Markets are a way of allocating scarce goods. What other ways might we do that? We could use a price system. We could use queuing, which is first come, first served. The thing is free, but you have to pay based on how long you stand in line. We could use chance, a lottery, a drawing, or we could use authority or discretion. Experts choose who gets it. How does Duke allocate student basketball tickets to the Duke UNC game? Do they sell them? Think, if we were to auction tickets to the Duke UNC game, think how much money the university could make. Given how rapacious Duke is, I mean, just look at the food service policy. They charge you at every possible point the maximum they think they can get plus a little. Why doesn't Duke auction basketball tickets? They give you all basketball tickets. Well, you have to pay a lot to get into the Duke UNC game because you have to live in tents for 2 or 3 weeks in January and nearly die of pneumonia. My son, who graduated in 2014, didn't want to leave the tent because the line monitors are all fascists, and some of y'all are line monitors, I'm sure. You're not, in fact, fascists, but the people in the tents think so because they're forcing you to stay in line. He had to go to the hospital because he actually had pneumonia because he's an idiot. I can't leave. I won't be able to go to the game. Why do we use queuing instead of markets to allocate basketball tickets? Anybody have an idea? To ensure the fanaticism of those who make it in. These have to be real fans. They've got to be, I don't know, what's the word? Crazy. These have got to be crazy people to get inside Cameron. Whereas if we auctioned it, then people would get in based on their wealth. We want fanaticism. I have suggested a solution. It's very wasteful to have to stay outside in tents for 3 weeks. All you need is a small Bunsen burner. So you have a table and a Bunsen burner and a stopwatch. How long are you willing to hold your hand in the open flame? This would take like 7-8 seconds per person. Okay, your hand is extra crispy. You're in. Okay, that's probably a bad idea, but some sort of something that causes pain, instead of weeks of pain drawn out over days and days, you need some other measure of fanaticism that can't be purchased. But notice that different rationing systems have different implications for who is advantaged. The price system advantages wealth. Queuing advantages people who either have a low opportunity cost of time or who really care. A lottery is perfectly fair in the sense that everyone is equally likely, but then that means that some people who don't really value the resource, the commodity, would end up getting it. And authority, maybe we could use a contest. Who could write the best essay? So there's other ways of allocating, but markets, for many commodities, have the advantage of rationing, but they also match the price of the resource with its opportunity cost. So the definition of efficiency that economists use is Pareto optimal. Pareto optimality is named after a scholar named Vilfredo Pareto, who was a sociologist economist. And Pareto optimality means there's no feasible reallocation of resources that makes everyone better off or makes at least one person better off and no one worse off. So if the outcome of some decentralized process is not Pareto optimal, then there is a market failure. A failure to enforce property rights, for example, a la Hobbes, so the state just doesn't do its job. That's not a Pareto optimum. So you've seen an example when we saw the Golden Balls game, when you saw the lecture that Undis gave about game theory. In a prisoner's dilemma problem, we would both like to have an enforceable contract that says neither of us defect. In the absence of that, we both defect and we could both be better off. So that's not a Pareto optimum. There's 5 ways that markets can fail to achieve Pareto optimality. These are the classic market failures. As you have seen, there is a question on the final that is explicitly about this. Information asymmetries, natural monopoly, externalities, public goods, and then we add another, which is justice. Is the income and wealth distribution that is produced by markets in accordance with our intuitions about justice? Now, the 5th one is arguably of a different sort, because it may require redistribution, and in fact, involuntary redistribution. The 5th problem could solve itself through charity. That is, if the wealthy really agree that it would be better for them to have less and the poor to have more, they're free to accomplish that through charity. But each of the first 4, has the property that literally everyone could be better off if we could solve it. So, the perfect competition model that economists sometimes use to justify markets is rather fanciful, as we have discussed before. It's really just a series of simplifying assumptions. Perfect and free information, price taking, private decisions, and private goods. Well, usually the way we justify this when we're teaching an economics class is when markets fail, that is a justification for government intervention. One of the problems with this class, and I realize this is frustrating, is that you recognize that what I've been calling government is in fact a unicorn. What is this thing called the state? Well, it's actually made up of human beings who work as politicians, interest groups, and bureaucrats. So when the market fails, saying there's a justification for state action would require that the state action doesn't actually make things worse. It probably won't. There are many circumstances where state action is justified, but at least you would want to ask, since we're comparing markets as they actually are, flawed, with state action, we should be comparing it with state action as it is, which is flawed. But today we're just looking at the market failures. Next time we'll talk about the possible government failures that offset them. But for now, when markets fail, government steps in. So one problem is the asymmetric information problem. Sellers tend to have more information than buyers, and we may not be sure of the actual properties of the thing being sold. There's at least 2 aspects of this. One is safety, the other is efficacy. Safety and efficacy. At one end of this range might be drugs. And I'm talking about legal drugs before you get that gleam in your eye. Only for legal drugs. The question is, which drug should be legal? Well, if I say I have an anti-cancer drug, it needs to have 2 properties. One, the drug itself won't kill you. It seems sort of misleading to say we cured his cancer. Yeah, but he died from the drug. He didn't die of cancer, though. He died from the drug. That's not very helpful. So the side effects are not too bad. Second thing is efficacy. That is, it actually accomplishes what it says. It cures cancer. So no side effects is safety. Efficacy means it actually cures the cancer. For drugs, we think it's pretty hard for people to tell that. So the answer, the example of a response to this problem of information asymmetry is the Food and Drug Administration. We have an actual federal agency in charge of making sure that drugs are safe and efficacious. Well, what about food? There's also information asymmetries about food. Do we have government agencies that are in charge of overseeing the provision of food? Well, the FDA is, after all, the Food and Drug Administration, so we have inspections. But for restaurants, when you go into a restaurant, which federal agency is in charge of making sure, which state or local agency is in charge of making sure the food does not suck? There isn't one. All we look at for food is safety. We think that people can tell on their own whether or not the food is good. So if I say this food is tasty, and you taste it and you say, actually, no, that's terrible, we're going to let reputation and word of mouth take care of that problem. So the only thing that we have for regulation of food is safety inspections. Health inspectors look at the kitchen to make sure that it's not too unsafe, that you're not going to get sick and die. If it tastes bad, that's on you. If you're trying to decide to go to a restaurant, which federal agency do you look at? Which government agency do you look at? You don't. You look at Yelp. You look at some private outsourced trust mechanism to look at reviews. At the bottom of the scale, in terms of our sense of the importance of information asymmetry, is movies. Movies, we don't have regulation for either safety or efficacy, which means that it's complete chaos. You can't tell which movie to go to, right? Well, no, you go to Rotten Tomatoes. Maybe you ask friends, but you go to Rotten Tomatoes. So the point is, there's both government and private market-created mechanisms for solving problems of information asymmetry. In the absence of state action, some private organization will find a way to sell that information. The question is, what is the correct balance between these two? Our sense is that the more difficult it is to tell whether or not something works, and the more dangerous it is if it goes wrong, the more likely we are to have government regulation. So drugs, we regulate both safety and efficacy. Movies, you're on your own for both. And then in between, we have restaurants for the three examples. The second example is the monopoly or monopsony problem. Market structure, in the sense of efficient production, may imply that there's really only one producer because the economies of scale are so large. And the most common example of this is the one that we saw on Monday with Professor Kiesling from Northwestern University. How many electric utility companies are there competing for your business? Usually just one. It's hard to imagine a whole forest of wires leading to your house. You get up in the morning, you want to make some tea, you think, oh, I need some electricity. You go over to the wall and there's a dial. You have 7 different electric companies. You check their prices, you turn it to 6 because that's the cheapest electric company for that day. Says no one ever. It's much cheaper to have one set of wires, and the economies of scale in production are so enormous that it's much cheaper to have one that produces 1,000 kilowatts rather than 2 that produce 500 kilowatts of output. Well, that means, though, that you have the problem of monopoly, and monopolies can charge pretty much any price they want. So this is the reason that instead of private unregulated companies to produce electricity, we have utilities. We have either private utilities whose rates and behavior are regulated by the state, or we have fully state-owned utilities that actually operate the electric production and distribution themselves. So for economic cost reasons, the most efficient structure is to have a single firm. We compensate for that by regulating their rate of return and the price that they can charge. The third, the externality problem, we've already talked about a little bit, including when I embarrassed myself and dressed as a woman and ate 3 bags of potato chips. Now, the nice thing about the potato chip example, which y'all saw, was that those were Utz potato chips, which is the Yiddish word for to annoy. So I thought that was a nice production value touch. The problem is that marginal social cost and marginal private cost differ when there's externalities. So we might be able to specify or concentrate property rights and use agreements, or we can impose taxes. Third thing we might do is what the Environmental Protection Agency does and just regulate the amount that can be produced. But in any case, externalities, when they involve large numbers of producers of the pollution, the noise, and you're dealing with large numbers of people suffering, each of whom suffer only a small amount, markets are really bad at solving those problems if we have large numbers and high transactions costs. So that's a justification for the state to have something like the Environmental Protection Agency and maybe a system of tort laws that allows people to handle privately smaller things like tort nuisances. Public goods, we've talked about a fair amount. Remember, the property of public goods is non-excludable and non-rival. Public goods are non-excludable and non-rival, like defense, clean air. We talked about whether National Public Radio, for example, is a public good. Well, the problem with public goods is it's very difficult for markets to provide them, because if they provide any, everyone can enjoy, and there's no way to charge for it. There's no easy way to charge for it. So the closer it is to a public good, the more underproduced it's going to be. Well, since it's underproduced and everybody would like more, it would be better if we could sign a contract saying everybody has to pay $10 in taxes, and then we'll all produce the amount that we want. That will give us enough revenue to produce the amount that we all want. People won't do it voluntarily, though, but they might all voluntarily sign an agreement that says anyone that fails to do this will be punished. I'm more willing to do it if I think everyone else will do it also. So the justification is everyone's going to be charged because everyone's going to enjoy it. So we can provide public goods much more efficiently through a collective contract than we can through one-to-one contracts, which are how markets work. And then the justice problem, which I'll raise only briefly. Justice problem is a little bit different, but there's still a market failure aspect that you can say to it. Suppose that I think that it is wrong for wealthy people to have as much money as they have, given how poor the very poorest are. Suppose further that everyone thinks that. All the other wealthy people think that also. But they recognize that providing this redistribution is a kind of public good. Well, since it's a public good, I would agree to pay my fair share, assuming everyone else is going to pay their fair share also. But the only way we can do that is to do it through taxes, which means anyone who doesn't do it will be punished. And this is the usual problem that we have with the choosing in groups, which is one of the reasons that I wrote that book. Problem with choosing in groups is all of us are two people. First, we're the person who wants to accomplish some collective objective. And second, we're the person who wants to cheat on that agreement once it's implemented. So most of us think we should have speed limits. And most of us think I individually, because I'm God's special snowflake, I should be able to speed. Well, I don't really think that, but still, when I'm doing 75 and a 45 and there's children draped over my bumper because I've gone through a school zone and the cop stops me, I think, that cop, he's out to get me. It's not because I was doing 30 miles an hour over the speed limit. Actually, it probably was because I was doing 30 miles an hour over the speed limit. So all of us are two people. We have this sense that collectively, here's the policy we should choose, and we have a sense that individually it'd be really great if I could cheat on that, which is the basic Hobbesian problem. That's why we need state intervention. Well, it's certainly possible to think of redistribution in just those terms. Let's suppose all of us think it would be better if there were less income inequality. Well, one way of achieving that is to have taxes that disproportionately are paid by those who have the most money. And even those who have the most money agree with that, but they don't want to have to do it unless everybody else does too. Because remember, they have the option of doing privately through charity. But if they're sure that everyone else is also going to have to pay higher taxes, they might sign an agreement. As soon as they sign the agreement, they hire a really smart tax accountant to try to get them out of the taxes they agreed to pay. Just like I want to be able to speed myself, even though I think there should be speed limits. So I'm not sure that argument really works, but I think that's a way of getting from the sort of market failure Pareto optimality problem to address the problem of income inequality. Many people, when they talk about the justice problem with markets, don't mean that the wealthy actually agree that they're willing to give money. They mean we should take money from the wealthy at gunpoint, which is a different thing. We should take money from the wealthy at gunpoint against their will is really a different problem. I think you can argue for that, but it requires a different argument. The point is, it's possible to make this argument even if we require unanimous consent, because everyone is two people. I'm the person who thinks we should give more money to the poor, and I'm the person that thinks, well, but I personally shouldn't have to give more money to the poor. Just pass over my house when it comes to taxes. All right, any questions about market failures? This is pretty straightforward.